How does a person become a monster? I mean, really. Today, we're going to dig into a source that tries to answer one of history's darkest questions. What were the origins of Adolf Hitler's ideology? We're going to trace the path from his early life to the formation of a worldview that would eventually plunge the entire world into war.
So right off the bat, the source we're looking at makes one thing crystal clear. It concludes that Hitler's entire worldview was built on a foundation of conspiracy, pure hatred, and just completely false racial ideas. And look, that's not a spoiler, that's the whole point. Knowing that this is the destination, we have to ask,
how does someone even get to a place like that? You know, a worldview that toxic doesn't just appear out of nowhere. To find the answer, the source says we have to go way back, right to the beginning, to the disappointments and frustrations that defined his early years.
Yeah, this story doesn't kick off with roaring crowds and massive political rallies. Nope. It begins quietly, on the streets of Austria, with a young man whose life was pretty much defined by a series of really profound personal failures.
The source shows us this really clear pattern of struggle. He was born in 1889, and his big dream was to be an artist, but that dream got crushed by rejection. And this wasn't just, a career setback. It sent him spiraling into poverty and aimlessness right before World War I. According to the source, this feeling of being insignificant, of being a failure, that's the crucial soil where all the resentment that came later would start to grow.
So, you've got this backdrop of personal struggle, right? Well, that's about to slam head-on into a global cataclysm. The source points to World War I as the crucible, the one single event that took all his vague discontent and forged it into something hard, something dangerous, an ideology.
You see, the war finally gave him what he'd been craving, a sense of purpose, of belonging as a soldier. But the source argues that when Germany eventually lost, it wasn't just a political or military thing for him. No, it was a deep personal betrayal. The one thing that had finally given his life some meaning had been destroyed.
So in the aftermath of that trauma, he needed an explanation. He needed something, anything, to make sense of the chaos. And he found it in extreme nationalism and racism. This wasn't just blind hatred, though. It was a whole framework designed to shift blame, to create an enemy who was responsible for everything, and to push this narrative of stolen superiority.
And these weren't just angry thoughts being shouted in a beer hall either. He was methodical. He actually codified this new worldview, putting his doctrine of hate down on paper for the whole world to see in his book, Mein Kampf.
At the very heart of his doctrine was this powerful, simple call for unity. Now think about it. For a nation that was feeling fractured and humiliated, this was more than just a political slogan. The source presents this as his foundational argument. He basically claimed that internal division and dissent had made Germany weak, and that's what opened the door for its enemies to win.
But unity for what purpose? What was the end game? Well, this is the answer. The source links these two ideas directly. Unity was the method, but the goal was power. The nation had to become this one single force to reverse its humiliation and reclaim what he saw as its rightful place in the world.
So, okay, let's connect all these pieces. The source lays out a really clear chain of events linking his personal life to politics to build its final argument.
It's really a tragic causal chain when you look at it. The source argues that his early life of failure created this deep-seated resentment. Then, the national trauma of Germany losing the war gave that resentment a target. This toxic combination fueled the development of his racist and nationalist ideas, which he then laid out in Mein Kampf as a blueprint for the future.
And this brings us right back to where we started. The source is absolutely emphatic in its final conclusion. This entire ideological structure, the scapegoats, the racial theories, the grand explanations for why Germany lost, was a complete fabrication. It was a story built not on reality, but on resentment and delusion. And that leaves us with a final and honestly a chilling question. The source explains how one man's worldview was built on lies, but it forces us all to confront a much bigger, much more terrifying thought. What happens when ideas with no basis in reality break free from just one mind and take hold of millions?